Carlton Lodge of Adrian. Carlton Lodge is sponsoring all ACTV broadcasts during the 2021 to 2022 school year. Located at 1629 West Maumee in Adrian, Carlton Lodge offers comfortable rooms and suites at affordable rates. There's also a heated indoor and outdoor pool, along with a 24-hour fitness center. Thank you for the continued support toward Adrian College Television.
The Adrian College Media Production House provides opportunities for students to learn and grow live on the airwaves, just like Matt Kibbe.
I've gotten a chance to create a relationship with coaches and teams and learn more from people instead of trying to teach myself something. Got an opportunity to expand my knowledge of sports, hone in on my skills as a broadcaster, and learn about equipment in different ways. You get more of a connection with professors as well. Providing opportunities, growing leadership. The Adrian College Media Production House. Thanks for tuning in.
Bulldog fans, connect with Adrian College TV on social media to be updated when we're broadcasting live, to see highlights, plays of the week, and much more. Adrian College Television is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. ACTV's handle is at Adrian College TV on every form of social media. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to the home of the Bulldogs, Adrian College TV.
Adrian College has once again been recognized for its commitment to engaged, experiential education by Colleges of Distinction, a one-of-a-kind guide for college-bound students. While higher education has changed over the past 20 years, Colleges of Distinction's selection process has stayed consistent in accepting only those that adhere to the 4 distinctions: engaged students, great teaching, vibrant community, and successful outcomes. Overlaid in the last few years have been a look into high-impact practices. They believe most critical to the student experience were the kinds of engaging experience that are found at Adrian College. To learn more, please visit adrian.edu.
I'm Matt Kibbe, the current student body president here at Adrian College. I chose AC because the campus simply feels like home. Everywhere I go, I know the amenities are there to help me succeed and get to the next level in my career. If you want to see what Adrian College has to offer, you can schedule an in-person visit at adrian.edu/campus-visit.
crosses over, back onto the far side. Rips a shot, she scores!
What if you didn't choose to become an Adrian College Bulldog? Surely you would have carried on with your education and could potentially be graduating elsewhere. But what would you have the honor of greeting Bruiser on campus? Would you have had the privilege of working alongside faculty that know your name? Would you have had the opportunity to learn and grow in an environment that is seeking the truth and dignity in all people? Would you have had a creative learning environment that is supportive of challenging you and achieving excellence in your academics, but also your personal and professional lives? This has been Adrian College's promise to us. Just as our families have promised to love us unconditionally and support us through the many peaks and valleys of our lives, Adrian offered a similar promise to us when they realized our potential by asking us to join them. While we have been busy navigating the many what-ifs of our time, none of which we could have imagined, we have indeed found the cane that holds our ribbons of excellence at Adrian to stand strong. Strength and tradition. A tradition that carries on from graduating class to graduating class. A symbolic reminder of the leadership carrying the motto, no victory without work. The Adrian College class of 2021 can proudly proclaim that we have earned our ribbon of excellence for persevering through a pandemic because of our hard work. We have had to learn how to best navigate the many what-ifs in uncharted times. While some of the what-ifs have been answered, it is now up to each of us to embrace and navigate on our own. What if I take that job? What if I decide to continue on for postgraduate endeavors? What if I decide this? What if I decide that? No matter what, you'll be able to face your tomorrow knowing that you are a member of a pack, the Adrian College Bulldogs class of 2021.
Part of the family here at Adrian College are the friends we've made. These friends have gone to games with you, shared late night tales with you, explored downtown with you, and joked around with you at Ritchie. They are in the library with you.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Tony Kumaduros, Professor of Philosophy and Leadership and the Director of the Adrian College Institute for Ethics. On behalf of Adrian College's Romney Institute for Law and Public Policy and the Adrian College Institute for Ethics, welcome to today's lecture, which is titled Questioning Justice, how the questions we ask either conceal or reveal corruption in the criminal justice system. Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Doggy, Vice President Rebar, Dean Milner, and the faculty at Adrian College for supporting our institutes, our lectures, our debates, and our programming. I would like to especially thank the Romney Institute interns, Nicole Darish and Giovanni Esquivel, who have worked very hard to make our events possible, successful this semester. Big thanks also to Professor Nathan Getting for co-sponsoring this lecture, and to Jay Hanna and his crew for filming. speaker today is Baynard Woods. Baynard Woods holds a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy from Duquesne University. He lives in Baltimore, where he covered criminal justice and protests for The Guardian and the Baltimore City Paper. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Oxford American Magazine, and many other publications. His most recent book, Inheritance, an autobiography of whiteness, will be published in June of 2022, so this month. Today, Baynard Woods will be discussing his work from his book, I Got Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Force. Please join me in welcoming Baynard Woods.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Tony. Professor Koumandoros and I went to grad school together 20 years ago, and the dissertation that I wrote was about how we become bad, how people break bad, even when they think that they are doing good. And that's been really the through line of my work since then. And it was certainly the case with this book with I Got a Monster, and then in some ways I turned that lens on myself in the upcoming book and on my family. How many of you have ever heard of the case of the Gun Trace Task Force? Wow, that's great. One of the reasons we wrote this book, I was covering the uprising in Baltimore in 2015 after police killed Freddie Gray, and then I covered those trials. And at the trials, there were, every news agency in the country had someone there. And they should have, it was important. But the trials themselves were sort of hijacked in a way it was all only about, were you trained to hook a seatbelt? Because of the theory of the case, which I think was a mistaken theory, but that's a different matter. But the theory of the case was that they killed him by giving him a rough ride rather than sliding him into the van. So it was on, and everyone was there every minute for testimony about seatbelts. In this case, no one knew what these officers were doing. They were finally federally indicted in 2017, but because that wasn't part of the national narrative at the moment, we weren't talking about police corruption as much, we weren't talking about police racism as much. Everything had to be directly about Trump or it wasn't going to be covered. There were no national news organizations there except for the BBC, one international, and then only local reporters. And it was such a tremendous and wild case of corruption that involved police officers who saw themselves as above the law, terrorizing a city that they saw as beneath the law. And this above and beneath the law has a lot to do with visibility and invisibility. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as a way to get into it. But let me give you just a brief sort of outline of the case and what they were doing for the people who haven't heard. And if you haven't heard about it, you probably will, because like next week, there's an HBO show about it that David Simon, who made The Wire, made, and it's going to be, and I have nothing to do with it. But it's going to make the case much more famous in the coming weeks. But so on March 1st of 2017, 7 police officers were federally indicted and arrested for racketeering, for the kind of charges that were created to bring down the mob. And it was conspiracy charges of wide-ranging, but the main things that they were doing for years and years and years were stealing drugs, breaking into people's houses, stealing money, selling the drugs back. One reason that we called them the most corrupt police squad is because they were all double and triple crossing each other as well. And their multiple members of the squad had their own drug crews that were selling what they were stealing unbeknownst to the other ones. And so they were each individually incredibly corrupt, as well as collectively corrupt. They were put together as a sort of super group of cruddy cops. And that was how they ended up coming down. And lest we think too highly of the federal investigators that brought them down, that they were really coming after, trying to root out these bad police. After Freddie Gray died, the Justice Department had, their Department of Civil Rights had an office that shared a wall with the Gun Trace Task Force, the name of this unit. And it actually gave cover. They had a bail bondsman coming in to steal drugs out of evidence control. And all of the cops in the building who didn't know him thought that he was a federal agent, so they let him just do what he wanted to do walking around. They didn't find out about this story at all. It was only after they were trying to bring murder charges against a heroin dealer for someone who overdosed on the heroin that they happened to accidentally stumble over these cops because the heroin dealer called one of the police officers. And so it remained, even when they were under direct civil rights investigation that found a pattern and practice of racist abuses in the police department, they still weren't able to uncover this kind of corruption because of when people in power like this just blatantly lie and falsify evidence, it's very hard to overcome. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. I first became, I guess one little bit of background, I first became aware of one of these cops. The other reason I wrote this book is in 2014, my co-author and I wrote a story. One of the officers, Daniel Herschel, was using rap lyrics and videos to get probable cause to raid someone's house in a way that wouldn't happen, for instance, to David Simon. Hey, there's a gun in that video. We need to, and then have a judge be willing to sign off on that for something that was in a work of art. And so then when we realized that this was the least bad of the cops among them, and that we only knew about him because he was out there aggressively also beating people up, doing these really blatant abuses, he was easier to get caught. And that's usually the kind of police officers, bad police officers that we catch. The ones who are doing sloppy things on the street. The ones who decide to be criminal from the start are much, much, much easier to catch because of the extreme protections that we allow them. So I don't know how many of you have read Plato's Republic or heard of the Ring of Gyges, the myth about Gyges' ring. And so they took it also for the Lord of the Rings, but it's a myth where a guy finds in this casket thing an old skeleton with a ring on it. He puts the ring on. He notices when he turns it a certain way, he goes invisible. Once that happens, ultimately he ends up killing the king, first seducing the king's wife, then killing the king, and then being a complete tyrant. And the argument is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But what I'm arguing today is that what we give to police officers in general is something like the Ring of Gyges that makes it very, very, as it says in the passage, no one could be found of such adamantine temper as to persevere in justice and endure to refrain his hands from the possessions of others and not touch them, though he might with impunity take what he wished even from the marketplace. And that's exactly the situation that we put certain police officers in every day. And these squads are specifically proactive. Whenever you hear the phrase proactive policing, that's what that means. So patrol, you get a 911 call, they'll come out to you. Homicide, they're trying to solve murders. Proactive, and they have all kinds of, the squad names change because they're usually getting in trouble. Go out and drive around in units of 4 or so, looking for what they think is trouble, proactively rather than responding to any crime that they see happening. And so they're supposed to find snitches and informants and find ways to get information, to uncover for them the invisibility of the streets and be able to make arrests. And in some cases, this is the oldest story in the world when we take off our institutional framework. So the 4 guys, there was one who was double, triple crosser, fast talker, like Odysseus in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was the smart guy, always coming up with a plan. There was the guy who was the fastest runner, who would chase down all of the other people, and he was always complaining that he wasn't given enough credit for how fast he was, for the people that he was taking, and almost left the unit because of that. And then they would give, but they would take their guns and stuff that they would get at the end of the week or in a big bus, and they'd put them on a table, and they'd take pictures of them and put them out, and the police department would get glory. And as they were breaking into these people's palaces, they were robbing the riches. So when we take our institutional framework off, we see that it also tells us something really serious about human nature and about what we do as humans when we're given too much secrecy and too much power, and the way that that corrupts us and prevents ethical action. In this case, there were already a lot of reforms coming into place because of the death of Freddie Gray, and these officers ended up thwarting almost all of those and using them to their benefit. But there were some times when they came to light. And the other part of as I interpret it, the main part of the Socratic project, to return to the ring of invisibility, is to help us figure out how to escape that for ourselves. How to live ethically, how to create then an ethical or a just society. And dealing with a justice system, this should be our number one goal, is to create something that is just. But how do you do that when the people that you have that are supposed to be creating justice are not only creating crime, but are incentivized to create crime? The more crime there is, the more money they would get. The more crime there is, the more power they would get. The more leeway they would get, the more essential that they would seem to be. So the Socratic project was we're all trapped in our own inability to see anything but our own perspective. And so what you do to that is ask questions to try to escape it. And I realized this is why I quit being a professor and became a reporter. I thought that the only way to really live a Socratic life rather than a Platonic or an Aristotelian life would be to go out and ask people who don't want to be asked the questions long enough until they're ready to kill you. And that was sort of the way that helped me understand a little bit about how this case worked, because from a journalistic perspective, any car crash, you go ask a whole bunch of people what happened. If you're the most basic beat reporter on it, you're going to ask everyone, put all those perspectives together, and try to come up with something. But we value in our criminal justice system what the police officers say much more highly and what prosecutors say than anyone else. So we're not able to achieve this way of escaping out of all of the subjective pitfalls that are inherently there, misapprehension, misperception, or the corruption and lies that can cause others to misapprehend or misperceive. So this book starts with a story. So a bright spring day in March, 3:30 in the afternoon. There's a black man sitting in a minivan on a leafy, sort of suburban, but still in the city street. And another guy comes out of a house carrying a backpack, walks over, and suddenly a police car comes up, unmarked car, a plain, they used rental cars, so not a police car, but one that 4 police officers were in, comes up, jump out of the car, pull the guys out. Turns out they were in the middle of a drug deal. They arrest them. Now, they say that this was just a lucky stop in trial under oath. Your Honor, I just happened to stop and always ask everybody when I see them how things are going. And we noticed there was money on the floor. We noticed this. There's a furtive motion. So there's all these words that they can use that allow them, that they know are the words they use, that allow the case to stick, that in fact pull the wool over people they're supposed to be working with, besides the prosecutors and others. What actually happened, and more has come out since we wrote this in the book, but what actually happened is they were using one of the guys, Mr. Stevenson, was under federal surveillance already. There was a DEA wiretap on his phone. And there was a thing going on in the war room where the federal agencies were sharing intelligence with the police department. He then took this, Sergeant Jenkins took this intelligence that had been being collected legitimately and used it to go and stop the guy here, but without acknowledging that he used it. In fact, he put a GPS tracker in addition to the other stuff illegally on the guy's car, so he knew exactly where the car was going to be. the guy's keys. They go and break into his house. They don't have a warrant yet. They could have gotten a warrant for his house because of the cocaine in the car. But there are, I think, 8 ounces of cocaine in the car, plenty to get a warrant. So they go, break into the house, take immediately the Sergeant Jenkins finds 10 kilos of cocaine in there. He takes 2, puts them under his bulletproof vest, walks out of the house where he has his bail bondsman waiting. Outside, a friend of his goes and gives him the 2 kilos. In fact, he tried to get the bail bondsman to get there first and break in before his other cops got there so he wouldn't have to share the loot with his fellow officers and just he and the bail bondsman would have to split. But the bail bondsman was too scared of busting into the house that someone else was already in there. So they go in, then they bust open the safe. They find $300,000 roughly in the safe. Take $100,000 out, close the safe back, then turn on the video camera and film them busting it open for a second time. Another surprise, oh my God, whoa, nobody touch anything, don't touch it. And get the feds here immediately, we're going to do this by the books, after they've already stolen $100,000 out of it. So this was at the very moment that we were saying that cameras were going to really be the solution to end up stopping police corruption and help with all of the problems of police shootings and stuff because of its own camera. We'll know. We'll see. It breaks through the veil of the ring of invisibility. In fact, it ended up helping add another layer of invisibility to what they were doing, enabling them to steal. Turned out that the federal agent who came in to help them collect the money and testified in the trial against them as a government witness, just as a law enforcement officer, has now been charged also for stealing money later on in the day, whether with them intentionally or just after he was taking it back to the office, he also then stole it. But cameras can help at some level. So a couple, and asking then if the people ask the right questions of the cameras. So a year and a half before this, he stopped a man that he also had information on that there's going to be cocaine in the car. They follow the guy. They find that the guy saw he's being followed, went back to his house, hid the cocaine in his house. They didn't know he did that, so they stop him. They search him for about an hour. They don't find anything, but in the meantime, they send someone else to go break into his house, go steal the drugs out of his house, sneak them back to the location, put them in the car so that they could justify the stop, say that it was a legitimate stop, and then get in the house and get anything else that was in the house. But so they wrote it up as if the informant told them, set up a sting, a fake buy, they were going to get him. But they didn't know there was a camera that caught it from a distance. And the officer was caught lying. He'd been caught on camera numerous times before, going back to 2008 when they busted into a bar, locked everyone in the bar, and robbed someone. But that guy, when they brought a suit, a white van drove up beside him, and a bunch of guns opened fire, and he was murdered, and the case never really went much further. This time, though, a prosecutor started to ask the questions. This doesn't look like the same thing that you wrote on the paper. And so she started asking questions, getting out of the trap of invisibility, pushed it up the line to the top prosecutor, and was herself summarily fired. The officer was investigated at the time. They weren't calling him to testify, but a number of powerful other police commanders came in and intervened on his behalf. So then, after the death of Freddie Gray, when murders started to rise, and they said, we need to get the numbers, we got to show everyone they forgot about all of these problems and said, this guy is getting the guns, we're gonna forget anything that they've done. And, as a side note, we've all been trained for this, like all of our lives, because every show that we've watched has some hero cop who's the good guy who really wants to get the bad there's some nerdy lieutenant trying to tell him to follow the laws. And he crashes cars and does all these things that we've all seen 1,000 times. And these guys were raised on that too. And they were imitating the art as much as the art was imitating life. They loved getting in car chases and stuff because that's what they thought they were supposed to be doing. Even though it in 2 cases involved them caused, that I know of, caused very, very serious accidents. So, he's back on the street and he's able to get this guy, Mr. Stevenson. The prosecutor in that case also could have noticed the implausibility of the just happening upon them, could have also noticed the problems with the case and just declined to prosecute it or questioned it, but they have the same pressure that the police department has. Bring in the numbers. You've got to get wins. When you're only worried about winning and losing, you're not going to have justice in any way whatsoever. Now, the defense attorney, he did know what happened. But it doesn't do very much, because what's the defense attorney going to do? Say, well, Your Honor, my client actually had 10 kilograms of cocaine and not just 8. Your job as a defense attorney is to defend your client and get your client off, not to bring to light, and except insofar as it helps your clients, the problems with the police officer. But this lawyer who had the case knew the MO of this officer from a 2010 case where a house alarm that a woman whose house he broke into, where she hit the house alarm, that called his whole story into question, and the case ended up being dropped. Although the officer then tormented this family for months and months and even years after that, showing up in front of their house, calling them from weird numbers, and would just not let it go. So, around this time, when this case finally went to court, these officers have also been involved in just countless thefts like this that have gotten out of control. They feel like they're about to get busted. He's going to take a leave of absence the day after the trial there. But it's too late, because while the ring of invisibility is only powerful when you can turn it on and turn it off. If you were just invisible all the time, then you wouldn't be able to take over the kingdom and everything. And the people that they were charging, except for surveillance, but in terms of their rights and stuff, were seen as invisible by the state. Part of that is when you're in jail, all of your calls are recorded and monitored. And so federal agents did end up asking the questions, what's up? Because they wanted to prosecute the guy. Because, 8 kilograms of cocaine, a bunch of guns, $200,000, that becomes a federal case. They hear him on the jail calls telling his wife what actually happened and how they broke into his house. And so he ends up, when they get charged, he ends up becoming a federal witness. To his great, great, great chagrin. Did not want to be there. But it was only the kinds of questions that, in all of these cases, the kinds of questions that are being asked by the officers who didn't want to know the truth, who didn't want to reach justice, who didn't want to arrest someone legitimately, but wanted to know how to increase power, how to increase wealth, and how to increase glory. And that's the ways we almost all go wrong. By one version of that. So, it's something that even if we're not in positions of power like that we need to think through and learn for ourselves the kinds of questions that can halt us from those things. And then our criminal justice system needs to start asking the questions that halt the kind of abuses like this that had been, for decades, black citizens of Baltimore had been saying that this was happening to them. And it had been ignored and ignored and ignored until the point that a federal prosecutor trying to charge someone with murder for selling heroin happened to stumble upon them. So how could we figure out better ways to address these kinds of issues? Because this was the moment of reform. This was the moment that there was supposed to be more training, that there was supposed to be body cameras, that there was supposed to be all of these things that were going to stop this, and none of them did. Cameras do help to some extent. You know, he got caught the first time in by being caught on the pole camera. The time before that, the bar had a camera. But they also used cameras to manipulate. And 99% of the time, you know, we got in this weird thing over the last several years where we think, oh, prosecutors, we thought about, do they prosecute bad police officers or not? You know, and Ferguson with Mike Brown not bringing charges, and Baltimore with Freddie Gray bringing charges. This became a way to measure prosecutors, but 99% of what prosecutors do is prosecute ordinary people. And 99% of what body cameras are used to prosecute is ordinary. And as we saw in Grand Rapids with Patrick Leoya, the officer turns off the camera just before he shoots him in the head. That's the ring of invisibility. You can choose when to be seen and when not to be seen. You control the evidence. You control the rules of the evidence. The same with the jail calls. The federal agents ended up stumbling again onto this case by listening to the jail calls wanting to prosecute who turned out to be the victim of the crime. But 99% of the time, that's used to prosecute him saying, yeah, babe, I got busted with those drugs like that, and I shouldn't have gone and, you know, say something careless that gets them in trouble. And so we have to make these things transparent. Because Axion, the company that controls almost all of the body camera footage in the country, is able to also has software that they're allowed to use in a lot of jurisdictions that edits that footage. It's supposed to be so you can draw an arrow and a circle and show what really happened, but they can do all sorts of stuff with it. Court proceedings in many places aren't transparent. I'm the plaintiff in a federal suit right now against the Maryland courts because they film all of the court proceedings, but they don't let journalists then broadcast that in any way. One of the only ways it ever comes out about corruption like this is in bench trials in court. I mean, at bench conferences in court. So when an issue about the arresting officer comes up in a court case, they don't want the jury to hear that until it's deemed legitimate for the jury to hear, and all kinds of countless other issues. So they'll come up to the bench with the judge, they'll turn on the white noise machine, and they'll have these, you know, the ring of invisibility, and they'll have these conversations about the integrity of the officer. We saw them lying on the stand hundreds of times, and we're told we weren't allowed to broadcast that, even though we were allowed to have it. And the First Amendment just does not give the federal government the right, or a state government, the right to say you can have this material. I'm not saying the material is classified or whatever, which, you know, there are cases where they say you can't have it. But you can have this material, but you can't share it. That's just not, and so we're going to win this case, most certainly. And that will make, because it then happened with the prosecutors go up. Your Honor, he broke into my client's house. They have it on camera. The prosecutors said it doesn't matter. They pushed the case anyway. We might think that that's fine, right? Because, well, the guy got off in the end. But he got out from this in November 1st of 2017, of 2016, and he was arrested on March the 3rd, or March 23rd. So imagine that 6 months of your life sitting locked up in a terrible situation, and you get off in the end, but that's just irrecoverable time, and people lose jobs, lose houses, lose all sorts of things. And so this question is the most important question that we can ask, is how can we create a system that's transparent enough that doesn't continue with this system that creates people who are above the law, who control their own visibility and invisibility, people that we see who are below the law. And another way of saying that is, when we think about the law, there are two parts of it: to be protected by the law and to be bound by the law. Police officers assume that they are protected by the law, but not bound by the law. So, for instance, one of the complaints in recent years has been, if I have to follow the Fourth Amendment, then, not violate people's rights from stopping them and searching and seizing, then I just can't do my job anymore. I'm just not going to do it. Just saying, if I can't break the law, I can't enforce my job. It's my job to be protected by all of the apparatuses of the state, but not bound by them in any way whatsoever. And then they think that the citizenry, and especially in a city like, Baltimore is really an apartheid city, so especially in a majority black but apartheid city like Baltimore, the police officers like Wayne Jenkins believed that that citizenry was to be bound by the law but not protected by the law. So in order to be able to create any kind of criminal justice system or justice system that comes close to a meaning of justice, we have to have people be equally bound and protected by the law. And as it is right now, we're not. One of the only ways for that to happen, and it's not a perfect thing, it's far from a perfect solution, but anything towards transparency, any notion towards removing that ring of invisibility from the way that laws are enforced in this country has to happen as a preliminary step before we can get to keep people from losing 6 months, years, and even their whole lives as a preliminary step to talking about what we might do to actually achieve something that's truly like justice. So we had talked about that I'd talk for about half an hour and then open to questions. So yeah, I don't want to take all the time. I'm happy to talk as much as people like, but I'd love to hear what kind of questions y'all have. Yes.
I have a question that responds directly to your comment that what you do essentially is ask people who don't want to be asked questions until they want to kill you. Okay? As I was reading this book, I became more surprised by the case that it's still alive. Why do you think that is?
Because most of the people in this book were already in prison by the time I was reporting it. And so there was, the dialogue and everything's from wiretaps, so they were already, and because of the legalities of publishing, I knew a lot more than I was able to put in here about a lot of other people, but if they hadn't been charged or convicted, the publisher's lawyers get very leery of that, and it was like we went over every sentence, and we spent 36 hours with the lawyer going over every sentence to make sure that that everything was. So there are people that I'm very surprised. There are people that I'm still concerned about. But for the most part, there wasn't any. There was one time when we were physically intimidated. Other times it was just trying to be shut down. But there was one case of physical intimidation. But fortunately, it didn't go anywhere.
When you're reviewing cases like these, when the task force is finally disbanded, do you get actually
the task force being disbanded? Not at all. And I think that that's part of the problem of the way we think we're going to fix these things. So, like, it became like the way in Baltimore that it's like BGF is Black Guerrilla Family. That's the big gang that when you just say the letters, people justify all kinds of stuff. And then it became the same way with GTTF. That they would say, and that actually, we disbanded GTTF, like that dealt with all the corruption. But that unit, all of these people had stolen, had robbed, had caused a fatal car crash and planted an ounce of heroin on someone to justify the chase. They had just done horrendous things way before they were ever in this unit with these names. And so getting rid of proactive policing, which is waging war on the residents of the city, effectively, that would have a difference. But just changing the name of the squad, they announced last week, we have a new unit coming with, and it's like the GTAF. They just changed, so no, disbanding a particular unit, I don't think, but changing the way that you see the purpose of policing to wage war on the citizens versus responding to calls for service would make some difference. Although I think we need, to be clear, I think we ultimately need to abolish the way that we have policing in this country altogether. I think there's no way to, in effect, what these officers were doing was a counterinsurgency against reform. And so the way we have it set up really creates conditions for that kind of abuse. And so I don't think it can be reformed, but nevertheless, I think we have to reform immediately in order to get towards conversations about what to do next. Yes?
How is it possible that individual officers have control over whether or not their camera is on?
They have a button to turn on their camera or not. It's crazy that we had a guy in, the first day these guys got cameras, he thought he was turning on, they didn't turn on the camera until after the stop, which defeated the purpose of it, but he thought he turned it off, and he walks up to another one of the cops, and he's like, it's off. And the guy's like, oh man, I really wanted to just beat his ass. And they're just saying all these things about the guy, and then they go and break into his house, and he films it on his own body camera because he didn't know it was on anymore, and it was the first day. And another guy, so they are on all the time, but they only save once you hit the button. And they go back 30 seconds before you hit it. So another guy got caught and criminally charged because he hit his button and he was pulling drugs out of a trash can. Like, oh, look, we found the drugs. But it went back 30 seconds earlier, and it showed him walk over to the trash can, put them in there, cover it back up, walk over here, pretend like he's walking up and find them. And so he also, by not knowing how it worked, ended up catching himself. But, giving that kind of autonomy to them, especially to turn it off and it goes off right when you hit it, that just seems, that's just outrageous.
Can there be such a thing as a morally decent police officer and a morally decent prosecutor?
I'm not sure. It's partly because I'm not sure what morally decent means. And so, like, if we say, can there be an ethical prosecutor or an ethical police officer? And so they follow the rules as they're set up. And and if we say, well, can someone be a good person in their lives outside of doing that? Most certainly. I mean, the same way that all sort of war criminals and whatever else are good to their children and whatever, the kinds of cases. And so I'm not sure what we would say morally decent is, but I do believe that it is, that the way that it is practiced presently is an immoral endeavor. Both policing and prosecuting generally are, and that's the question, like, how does justice intersect with morality is a really tough question. And I have some friends who are cops and prosecutors, but I also have friends who are in prison for murder. And so I'm not sure how much of the distinction I would always draw on a moral level between those sometimes, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. One of the things that became clear, the only economy of Baltimore is the underground economy. Our economy is the drug economy that funds basically everything else, because Bethlehem Steel, everything else has left the city. We were a city of 1 million, it's now a city of under 600,000. And so illegal money goes everywhere, and during the 90s and 2000s, the drug war especially, was the economy where you were on one side or the other. So one of the cops in this book was, his family were immigrants from Africa. He grew up in a northeast Baltimore neighborhood. We often say, like, what we need is more police that come from the community. And his sister was a stellar doctor, stuff. But him and his best friend became a big member of the drug crew. He became a cop. They both were just taking essentially the factory job that was open to them. You know, there was a working class neighborhood, and those were the two jobs. And there wasn't any moral decision on the police side or the drug dealing side about whether what you were doing was moral. It's like, which one's the better job? Like most people ask when they are looking for a job. And that's how they got caught in the end, because the cop who was the one who became a cop was calling one of his friends who he grew up with, who was running the drug crew, and they had his phone tapped. And so they were like, whoa, he's calling a police officer? And then they started, all these other pieces started falling in together. But yeah, putting people in cages seems hard to say that that's a moral activity.
Does that extend to federal prosecutors prosecuting police officers?
It does. I mean, the big injustice is that the guy who they had his phone tapped, that the police officer called, got 25 years for conspiracy to sell heroin. And this cop who stole and sold pounds of heroin over the years, also cocaine, also tortured people, kidnapped people, falsely arrested people. He also got 25 years. And it was partly because federal sentencing guidelines. Of course the cop hadn't had any previous arrests. The other guy had 4 previous arrests, all by officers affiliated with that officer. And each one of those counted on the federal guidelines to his sentences. I think it's very, very wrong to charge someone with murder who sold heroin. There's not a jurisdiction in the country that has a speed limit above 75. Yet every person in this room's car probably has a speedometer that goes up to 160. And if you're not charging those car dealers with murder when someone dies in a car crash from that, it seems hard to say that you then charge a heroin dealer when someone overdoses on the heroin and it's not an intentional. So I find that, and it's the same prosecutor involved in both of those. I think it does apply. Nevertheless, I don't know how to then. I do think, as we were talking about this morning, that there are situations. The usefulness of the federal government, federal law enforcement, often is when because local law enforcement tyrannizes local communities with no larger adjudication. So, like in the case of one of the first big FBI cases, the Osage Nation were the wealthiest people per capita in the world in the early 20th century because the reservation, and they were kicked out of Kansas, the little house in the prairie people, that's what they were doing. I was kicking the Osage out of that part of Kansas, moved them to Oklahoma. There happened to be oil underneath there, and amazingly, when they got moved to the territory, they were able to keep the mineral rights. So they were super rich, but they made it where you couldn't get your money if you were an Osage unless you had a white protector who would sign off on it. So the white protectors ended up just murdering hundreds of Osage to steal their money, marrying them even, like being in years-long relationships and poisoning them slowly every day. And it's horrible things. And the FBI came into, and the law enforcement and coroners and everyone else there were, the whole white establishment of the town was involved in it. So in that case, like, as long as we have local law enforcement, we have to also have some federal system, because the tyranny of unrestrained localities can be so great. But again, that's just a part, we ultimately, I think, have to do away with that whole system like that. But I think we have to do what we can while we can.
So when it comes to like proactive policing, when
Well, so those are two totally different things. So responding to 911 calls isn't what they say when they say proactive policing. Proactive policing never responds to a call, but goes out, cruising high crime areas and looking for someone making a furtive motion, and then you say, oh, he's carrying a gun, and you pull up on him real fast, throw him down, whatever. So I do think that there are certainly situations where people need to call emergency in a 911 case. And one of the problems with policing is that we've taken all of the resources, because of the ways that they're evaluated and stuff, to be doing these proactive kinds of arrests rather than doing things like, and I do think we need unarmed people often responding to emergency calls rather than armed people. But we've put all of the budget in policing away, like in a city like Baltimore. It's our biggest budget item, over $560 million every year in a city that, like, our schools don't have heat. And you still can't get anyone to come when people make 911 calls. They call it underprotected, underserved, and over-enforced, or over-policed and underserved. Because you don't get the calls for service when you need them, but when you're walking to the store, you're made to sit down and you get strip searched and you get humiliated on the street. And the same goes with solving murders, too, which is the other thing that people will say, well, don't you think we need that? We have, as this was going on, a 30% homicide clearance rate. So if you kill someone in Baltimore, you have two-thirds of a chance of getting away with it entirely. And so they're not doing the things that people say they want police to do, and they're doing the things that people say they don't want them to do. But we still keep going that way because it's the way that the higher-ups want it to happen. But it is also, that is the, in the case of Freddie Gray, it was patrol officers who chased him down. In the case of so many of the shootings that get caught on cameras, it'll be patrol officers who are showing up for an emergency situation or something. But that is, in cities where there are proactive policing, that's by far the majority, the minority of cases that end up in death or severe harm to people. It's usually the jump out boys, the knockers, the knockos, whatever they call these squads, elite squads, is the other word that you'll always see that roam around. We had 3 people die from being thrown down by these guys in the years right leading up to this. There were all of these people. The other thing they would do is when they ran over a guy who was running from them, and then they called another guy to come bring a BB gun to plant. So they're in total control of the scene and the evidence. So they plant heroin on one guy, they plant a fake gun on another guy, and they don't want the patrol guys around often when they're doing these things because those guys might actually be writing the report and see something. Usually they won't say anything because the other guys have so much more power, but they try to get away from the patrol guys. I'd see them as just kind of losers.
Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.